September 13th, 1944. The Stolberg corridor, south of Aachen. The morning air is thick with the scent of wet pine and damp earth, heavy with the metallic tang of diesel exhaust. For years, the German Lancer had been told that the Westwall was an unbreakable shield, a sprawling belt of over 18,000 bunkers, tunnels, and tank traps stretching from the Netherlands to Switzerland. Inside a Type 10 pillbox, the air is stale, tasting of machine grease and the cold sweat of nervous men. The German defenders peer through narrow concrete embrasures, expecting the Americans to halt at the dragon's teeth, rows of jagged concrete pyramids designed to belly-high a tank and leave it a sitting duck for anti-tank guns. Suddenly, the ground trembles. It isn't just the rhythmic thud of distant artillery. It is the screech of steel on stone. Through the thinning fog, the olive-drab silhouettes of M4 Shermans emerge. But they aren't stopping. They aren't maneuvering for a flank. To the horror of the men inside the fortress, the roar of the engines grows louder, rising above them. The sunlight through the firing slit is suddenly extinguished as 30 tons of steel tilts upward, its tracks clawing at the concrete face of their bunker. The Americans aren't just attacking the line, they are climbing it. The vibration of the tank's tracks vibrates through the reinforced walls, a mechanical predator claiming its territory atop the very roof that was supposed to protect them. By the late summer of 1944, the Wehrmacht was a force in terminal retreat. The devastating collapse of the front in Normandy, following Operation Cobra, had turned a disciplined withdrawal into a panicked rout across the plains of France. For the German High Command, the situation was catastrophic. The miracle in the West had ended, and the Allied broad front strategy was now hammering at the very gates of the Reich. As American, British, and Canadian divisions raced toward the German border, they outran their own supply lines, fueled by a belief that the war might truly be over by Christmas. However, as the pursuit reached the fringes of the German frontier, the geography of the war changed. The rolling French countryside gave way to the dense, dark canopies of the Hürtgen forest and the rugged hills of the Eifel. Here, the Allied momentum hit a literal wall. This was the Siegfried Line, or, as the Germans called it, the Westwall, constructed between 1938 and 1940, and long abandoned as a mere storage facility during the years of German triumph. The line was now being frantically reactivated on Hitler's direct orders. For the exhausted German soldiers of the 7th Army, the Westwall represented more than just a defensive position. It was their final sanctuary. While many of the retreating units were under strength or composed of stomach and ear battalions, men previously deemed unfit for frontline service due to chronic ailments, they were now being funneled into a labyrinth of concrete. The psychological shift was immediate. No longer caught in the open under the terrifying gaze of Allied J-bows, ground attack aircraft, the defenders now looked out from behind 3 feet of reinforced concrete. They were prepared to make the Americans bleed for every inch of German soil. The Westwall was not a single line, but a defensive zone 3 to 20 miles deep, consisting of over 18,000 individual bunkers, tunnels, and troop shelters. Its most iconic feature was the Hockerlinie, or dragon's teeth, rows of reinforced concrete pyramids designed to trap and expose Allied armor. These obstacles were strategically placed in kill zones, where hidden anti-tank guns and MG-42 machine gun nests could rake the stalled columns. To the American GIs, who had spent the last 3 months in a high-speed pursuit, the sight of these gray, jagged teeth rising from the earth was a sobering reminder that the easy phase of the liberation was over. By mid-September 1944, the U.S. First Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, arrived at the Stolberg corridor, a narrow strip of low-lying ground south of the ancient imperial city of Aachen. Facing them was a formidable section of the line that hadn't just been maintained. It had been integrated into the natural limestone ridges and dense forests. The German defense philosophy relied on interlocking fields of fire, where every pillbox was protected by the fire of at least 2 others. If the Americans attacked one, they would be hit from the flank and rear by others they couldn't even see. The German commanders believed that even if their troops were inexperienced, the sheer weight of concrete would hold the Amos at bay. They anticipated a slow, grinding infantry battle of attrition. What they did not expect was the mechanical aggression of the American armored divisions. The 3rd Armored Division, known as the Spearhead, was already experimenting with ways to bypass these unpassable obstacles. They weren't interested in a siege. They were looking for a way to break the teeth of the Reich and drive their tanks over the very heart of the German defense. On paper, the M4 Sherman was never designed for siege warfare. Its 75mm or 76mm main gun, while effective against medium armor and infantry, was largely useless against the 3-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls of a German Regelbau pillbox. High explosive rounds would simply shatter against the surface, leaving nothing but a black scorch mark and a ringing ear for those inside. However, the American tank was more than just its gun. It was a mobile platform for engineering ingenuity. To overcome the Siegfried line, the Americans turned to Kulin hedge cutters, the steel prongs originally designed to rip through Norman hedgerows, and specialized dozer blades. These modifications allowed the tanks to move earth, create ramps, and physically manipulate the environment. By pushing mounds of dirt against the base of a bunker, the Sherman could create its own incline. This transformed the tank from a direct-fire weapon into a mountain-climbing juggernaut, capable of ascending the very slopes the Germans thought provided natural protection. The success of the bunker climb was not the result of tanks acting alone, but rather a masterclass in small unit coordination. In the Stolberg corridor, the U.S. Army perfected this Siegfried line protocol. First, infantry would suppress the bunker's firing slits with small arms fire and Browning automatic rifles, forcing the German gunners to keep their heads down. Simultaneously, combat engineers from the 23rd Armored Engineer Battalion would move forward under the tank's protective shadow, carrying satchel charges or pole charges, blocks of C4 explosive designed to be shoved into ventilation shafts. Once the engineers had cleared a path through the dragon's teeth, using demolition snakes or bulldozers, the tanks would move in for the kill. Instead of sitting back and trading fire, the Shermans would charge forward into the dead zone, where the bunker's fixed guns could not depress low enough to hit them. By positioning the tank directly on top of or against the bunker, the crew could effectively neutralize the fortification without firing a single shell through the walls. For the German defenders, the bunker was supposed to be a fortress of modern engineering, but in the heat of the American assault, it quickly became a claustrophobic trap. Inside, the air was a choking mixture of cordite fumes, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the hum of ventilation fans that often failed under the concussive force of nearby explosions. The men, many of them older reserves or teenagers, lived in a world of narrow slits and gray shadows. When an American tank began its ascent onto the roof, the sensory experience was terrifying. The sound was a grinding, high-pitched screech of metal tracks against concrete, accompanied by vibration so intense it shook the mortar loose from the ceiling. Dust rained down on the defenders as the massive weight of the Sherman compressed the structure. To the men below, it felt as though the sky itself was collapsing. They were blind, their periscopes were crushed, and their firing ports were blocked by the tank's hull or the dirt it kicked up. In those moments, the impenetrable fortress felt like a pre-poured concrete coffin. German military doctrine was rooted in a rigid understanding of terrain and defensive geometry. Their engineers had calculated the exact degree of slope a tank could navigate and the precise spacing of dragon's teeth to halt any mechanical advance. They viewed the Americans as technologically superior in mass production, but tactically soft or predictable. Seeing a Sherman tank, a machine they often mocked as the Ronson for its tendency to catch fire, defy the laws of their defensive planning, was a profound psychological blow. Reports from captured German officers in the Aachen sector frequently mentioned a sense of impudence or recklessness in American tactics. They were stunned that the U.S. tankers would risk rolling their vehicles at such extreme angles, potentially exposing their thin belly armor or flipping the tank entirely. This willingness to improvise, to treat a multi-million-dollar defense system like a mere speed bump, eroded the German defenders' will to fight. When the tanks sat atop the roof, the supermen of the Reich found themselves looking at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable satchel charge to be dropped down their own air vents. September 15th, 1944. The outskirts of Münsterbusch. The morning mist clings to the valley floor, but the sound of the 3rd Armored Division's engines cuts through the silence like a saw. The objective is a cluster of heavy pillboxes guarding the road to Stolberg. These aren't just bunkers. They are reinforced bastions integrated into a steep embankment, surrounded by a double row of dragon's teeth. To the German 12th Infantry Division, the position is unassailable. From their elevated concrete perches, they have a 360-degree view of the killing field below. Any vehicle attempting to navigate the narrow gaps and the obstacles should be an easy kill for the 88mm pack guns hidden in the tree line. The assault begins not with a roar, but with the methodical violence of the combat engineers. Under a curtain of smoke shells and the frantic rattling of .50 caliber machine guns, the men of the 23rd Armored Engineer Battalion dash forward. They are carrying snakes, long, explosive-filled pipes, which they slide between the concrete teeth. A deafening crack echoes through the valley, and a section of the gray pyramids vanishes in a cloud of dust and pulverized stone. The path is open, but the pillboxes remain, their MG-42s stitching lines of fire across the mud. As the smoke clears, the German defenders see something that defies their training. Instead of halting to engage in a long-range duel, the Shermans of the Spearhead Division surge forward through the gap. One tank, commanded by a sergeant who had seen enough of the Westwall to lose his patience, drives straight for the base of the nearest bunker. The tank's nose dips as it hits the drainage ditch, then tilts skyward. The engine screams, the RPMs redlining as the tracks bite into the vertical face of the embankment. The tank isn't just approaching the bunker, it is aiming for the roof. The Sherman groans, the heavy steel of its hull scraping against the reinforced concrete with a sound like 1,000 fingernails on a chalkboard. Inside the bunker, the German squad leader watches in sheer disbelief as the snout of the 75mm gun rises past his viewing slit, followed by the massive, muddy tracks of the American machine. The ceiling, thick enough to withstand a direct hit from a heavy howitzer, begins to flake. Dust and chips of stone fall onto the Germans' helmets as 30 tons of American engineering settles directly over their heads. The psychological effect is instantaneous and paralyzing. The tank's weight seals the heavy steel doors from the outside pressure of the earth it displaced, and its belly armor now blocks the primary ventilation shafts. The Germans are literally buried alive by a tank. From the turret of the Sherman, the American commander doesn't even need to fire his main gun. He simply traverses the turret, using the long barrel to sweep the surrounding trenches, while his bow gunner sprays the rear exits of the neighboring pillboxes. Then comes the calling card. A combat engineer, using the tank as a shield, climbs onto the rear deck and drops a white phosphorus grenade or a satchel charge directly into the bunker's air intake. A muffled thump vibrates through the tank's hull. Seconds later, a white flag, or a frantic white rag, is poked through a side embrasure. The impenetrable fortress has surrendered to a tank that treated it like a ramp. Across the Stolberg sector, this scene repeats. The Germans, once confident in their concrete skin, realize that their bunkers have become static targets for an enemy that refuses to play by the rules of static warfare. By the end of the day, the invincible line has a gaping hole, and the road to the Rhine is no longer a dream, but a visible horizon. The silence that followed the breach of the Stolberg sector was perhaps more haunting than the roar of the engines. For the German High Command, the fall of these keyhole fortifications was a strategic nightmare. The Siegfried Line had been marketed to the German public and the rank-and-file soldier as a permanent barrier that would drain the lifeblood of the Allied armies. Instead, in a matter of days, the Spearhead Division had demonstrated that concrete was only as strong as the morale of the men inside and the mobility of the enemy outside. As the Americans consolidated their positions, the interior of the captured bunkers revealed a grim reality. Many were filled with stomach battalion soldiers, older men with chronic digestive issues, who had been left with inadequate ammunition and outdated maps. When the tanks climbed their roofs, the technical failure of the fortifications became a psychological collapse. Reports from the U.S. First Army noted that once the first few bunkers in a chain were crawled and neutralized, the defenders in adjacent pillboxes often fled or surrendered before the tanks even reached them. The myth of the Westwall's invincibility had been shattered, replaced by the realization that these concrete nests were actually stationary targets for an increasingly creative American war machine. The capture of these positions allowed the Americans to bypass the city of Aachen initially, encircling it and making it the first major German city to fall to the Allies. The tactical innovation of using tanks as bunker scalers saved countless American lives that would have otherwise been lost in suicidal frontal infantry charges. However, the cost of the breakthrough was still high. The surrounding Hurtgen forest remained a dark, treacherous labyrinth where the advantage of armor was neutralized by the terrain, reminding the Americans that while they could climb the bunkers, they still had to fight for every yard of the forest floor. By the time the dust settled over the Stolberg corridor, the statistical reality of the Westwall campaign began to emerge. Between September and October 1944, the U.S. First Army had neutralized hundreds of individual fortifications, while the German propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, continued to broadcast messages of a fortress Germany that would exhaust the invaders. The internal reports of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, told a different story. They recorded a terrifying loss of heavy equipment and, more importantly, a catastrophic loss of faith among the troops tasked with holding the line. The American tank climbing tactic forced a radical shift in German defensive strategy. Recognizing that static concrete was no longer a guarantee of safety, the German commanders were forced to pull their remaining mobile reserves, precious panzer divisions, out of strategic reserve to plug the gaps. This was exactly what the Allied High Command wanted, to draw the German armor into a battle of attrition where Allied air power and superior logistics could grind them down. The impenetrable wall had become a vacuum, sucking in German resources that were desperately needed for the defense of the Rhine or the upcoming Ardennes offensive. Furthermore, the American military took these lessons to heart. After the Siegfried Line, the U.S. Army refined its combined arms doctrine. The bunker-busting teams became standardized, with tanks, flamethrower units, and engineers working in a synchronized rhythm that would later be used to devastating effect during the crossing of the Rhine and the final push into the German heartland. The bunkers, once symbols of Nazi defiance, were now being used by American GIs as dry barracks or storage depots, their heavy steel doors frequently blown off their hinges to serve as makeshift bridges over muddy trenches. The psychological barrier of the German border had been physically and symbolically crushed under the weight of American steel. The image of a 30-ton Sherman tank perched atop a German bunker remains one of the most striking metaphors for the collapse of the Third Reich. It was the moment where the static, rigid philosophy of the past collided with the fluid, mechanical ingenuity of the future. The Siegfried Line was built on the 19th century belief that enough concrete and steel could halt the march of time and the will of an enemy. But as the American tankers proved in the mud of the Stolberg corridor, no wall is truly impassable to those who refuse to see it as a dead end. For the German soldiers who watched the sky disappear beneath American tracks, the stun was more than just tactical surprise. It was the realization that their world had been outpaced. The Westwall did not fail because its walls were too thin or its guns too small. It failed because it was a stationary solution to a mobile problem. The American GIs, men like the mechanics, farmers, and students who manned those tanks, brought a spirit of improvisation that could not be mapped out by German engineers or accounted for in Wehrmacht doctrine. History often remembers the great crusades of World War II through the lens of massive beach landings or sweeping pincer movements. Yet, the war was often decided in these small, brutal intersections of grit and concrete. The bunker climb was a testament to the fact that in warfare, technology is only a tool. It is the human capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to literally drive over the obstacles of the old world that defines the victor. Today, the moss-covered remains of the dragon's teeth still snake through the German countryside, silent and broken. They serve as a lasting monument to a failed ideology that placed its faith in walls, and a reminder of the day that American steel didn't just break the line, it climbed right over it.